Very good.
Yes. Introduced Pablo Valladares, who's here for a month from Chile to work with me and my group. So, in the genetic.
So, Gabriella is here unexpectedly relative to the timing of this seminar. Otherwise, she'd be a co-author of it, certainly. This is the centennial year of the museum, as you all know. And so today, what we're going to be doing is presenting a 40-year segment of the history of the museum. And that's a segment that deals with salamanders in Central America. When I came to Berkeley in 1969, I'd been at the University of Chicago previously, and I had at that time started the field program in studies of tropical salamanders. And when I arrived at Berkeley, I found a group of enthusiastic graduate students waiting to participate in this, in particular Jim Lynch, who is regrettably deceased. But Jim was heavily involved in this right from the beginning. Now, what we're going to do today is I'm going to start by just briefly telling you what we found during our 11 years of study in Guatemala before we moved on to other parts of Central America. And then Sean and Ted will tell you what's happened in the intervening 40 years, and then I'll finish off with some comments. Let's see. Yeah, that's right. That's what I did. Anybody?
Just while we're sorting that out, can I ask folks inside to move up a little? Because there's people outside.
Doing what I wanted to do. All right. It's something's about the timing. So, Guatemalan salamanders, which we're going to start by talking about first, we'll use Guatemala as a point of departure for Mexico and Guatemala, actually. All Guatemalan salamanders are members of the family Pleconodidae. These are the lungless salamanders. It's the largest family. It's one of 10 families of salamanders, and the only one to have any representation in any real representation in the tropics. And in the New World tropics, it's undergone a very extensive adaptive radiation, so that 40% of the living species of salamanders are included in one small clade within this group. The center of this radiation is the highlands of Guatemala and of neighboring Chiapas, Mexico, where most of the genera and more than 40 species occur. So it's a real hotspot for tropical salamanders. Now, all of these tropical salamanders, just to give you a little background, have direct terrestrial development. There's no larval stage. They never go near the water. And they are fundamentally terrestrial in all aspects of their life. And they live in a wide variety of habitats, microhabitats, and at many different elevations. They all feed in the same way, using a highly projectile tongue. So the adaptive radiation is one that's based on locomotion and use of ecological space. We find a lot of ecological and elevational, altitudinal differentiation. And that was what we set out to study, because it's unusual for an adaptive radiation not to involve more than that. But in this case, it was a limited one, and we thought this would be an interesting thing to examine. Carl Schmidt of the Field Museum in Chicago published an important paper in 1936 focusing on geographical ecology, and I wanted to extend Schmidt's work. So my group in MVZ then conducted field work from 1969 until 1979, focusing on Guatemala. In 1969, we started this with an extensive, actually in the 69 and early 70s, we had year-long programs, but then it involved many visits during the year, throughout the year, all different times of the year, until finally we were forced by political and sociological upset in Guatemala to really leave the country. Jim Lynch was captured by some people who thought he was just simply too big and marched him into at gunpoint into San Marcos. Another time, another student, Paul Elias, was kidnapped and held captive for 3 or 4 days. And so we finally got the message that it was time to go. Our goals for this study were to study how local communities of salamanders were organized and how they had evolved, to resolve taxonomic problems, to determine geographic distributions and ranges, and to develop a robust phylogenetic hypothesis. And these goals continue even to this day, amazingly enough. Schmidt's vision of salamander distribution was shown in several illustrations in this 1936 paper. And what you see here is the level of the Guatemala escarpment, which is very high, nearly 3,000 meters over near the Chiapan border, and it steadily falls off. And attached to the edge of the Guatemalan plateau on the Pacific are these very high, dramatic volcanoes, which go up to 4,000 meters. This actually, Tajumulco is 4,200 meters. But the volcanoes down here are the ones that really seem to be looming because they arise almost from sea level, whereas these are attached to this 3,000 meter plateau. And along this entire face, then, we find cloud forest, which is fragmented. So cloud forest occurs here, 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 here. And we were interested in looking at these. We thought, well, this is a great opportunity to see the repetition of these communities. We focused in particular on Volcan Tajumulco. And this is, again, from Schmidt's work. Schmidt found 9 species on Volcan Tajumulco, and this was the, he used feet. This is 14,000 feet, which is about 4,200 meters. And this is the way he displayed the distribution of these salamanders along the area, where he has solid lines based on his own observations. And these are inferred distributions. So he had 9, and here we've shown you a few of these. In the lowland, we get this great big animal with fully webbed feet. These 2 are cloud forest forms. And this animal, which at the time that Schmidt worked had the wonderful name of Oedipus rex, is now Pseudoeurysia rex, was living up here at the top. So that's where we started, with 9 species. Now, over a number of years then, we did a field work on Volcan Tajumulco. Here's Volcan de Agua, which is one of those that rises almost from sea level. And this is Volcan Tacana on the Chiapas border and Volcan Tajumulco. And this was our local transect. This is Volcan Tajumulco. And our transect was located in this area, went on up this way, and then came down along this way, and went all the way into, basically into Chiapas. This is right on the Mexican border. So this is what we found. We found 15 species instead of 9. And what we're showing here are just the absolute limits of the ranges, because it's important to recognize that these animals are really elevationally bounded. They really have sharp limits. Only Rex goes all the way to the top, or almost to the top. We've got a discrete set of species down here, but we devoted most of our time looking at this group of species in the cloud forest. Those are the ones that attracted our greatest attention, and they're the most interesting too in many respects. The bars, the different markings of the bars, just shows the different genera, and just gives you a rough idea of the amount of phylogenetic diversification that is taking place. I should just say that we've been running these elevational transects on many different mountain ranges from Panama to Mexico. And a shocking effect really is that every single transect is unique, unless they're just really close together, like Tajumulco and Tacana. And usually we find they're just unique. They have unique representation, and often species that are found only on those transects. That, in fact, is the norm. Now, these are the species that we added to the group, and it's amazing that Schmidt didn't find them, because this species, Vertebrate rostrata, here shown guarding its eggs, was one of the commonest forms that we found. And former student of mine, Lynn Houck, did her doctoral dissertation on the reproductive biology of this species. It's very, very common. And Pseudorisia bernata is another species that Schmidt missed, possibly because it's more or less cryptic, and looks very similar to Pseudorisia globuli, with which it co-occurs. He also missed this bizarre animal from the lowlands, a burrowing animal. So he missed really some of the most interesting species, and it may be because they just weren't there, or more likely he just didn't spend enough time there. I pressed the button and I think I'm waiting, but I'll do it again. There we go. These were not that.
It's running on the experiment there. It's running on wireless. It's not.
Oh, I don't like the experiment. So here is the. This diagram shows you the pattern of microhabitat use. This is based on 1,100 observations, and it's a proportionality diagram, so that a true generalist would sit right here, and something that's always arboreal, that is a bromeliad specialist, is up here, and also a banana specialist. This is a bromeliad specialist, that's a banana specialist. These are things that occur right on the ground, and these are organisms that occur off the ground, under the bark of trees or standing logs. So this just gives you some idea of the diversity of organisms. So when we left Guatemala in 1979, we'd reached this stage. We felt we had a really good understanding of the way in which space and microhabitat was being used by these organisms, and we had a good understanding, because we had very large series of all of these animals, of what was actually there. So now Sean is going to take over and tell us what has happened in the interim.
So, as Dave just said, in 2005 we returned to Guatemala, and one of our main goals was to gather material for phylogenetic analyses from this transect, because many of the old samples were ground for allozyme analyses and are no longer useful. And along with Ted Gabriela Parra, our collaborator Carlos Vasquez Almazan from the University of San Carlos in Guatemala, and Ernesto Recuero from Spain were on this trip. And although we tried to visit sites all throughout the transect to get an idea of what had changed from the past, we primarily concentrated our efforts in two sites in the cloud forest community, and specifically the upper cloud forest area, because you can sort of see there are two distinctive components of the cloud forest fauna, the upper and the lower part. And the upper cloud forest is the most diverse community of salamanders. You can actually find 6 different salamanders of 3 genera sympatrically in the upper cloud forest. And I'm going to be talking primarily about 2 sites today in the upper cloud forest. The first is called Buena Vista. It's sort of at the lower level of this community at about 2,400 meters elevation. And the second site is called El Rincon, and it was one of the main sites of cast study at 2,700 meters. And so just to sort of cut to the chase, things have happened since 1979, and it's not good news. So while they found hundreds, if not thousands, of most species of salamanders between 1970 and 1979, we found just a handful, if any at all. You can see there were 3 species of Pseudorisia which we never found in 3 years. The 4th one was represented only by 9 specimens, 6 of which came from a single log. Vertebrate rostrata, which Dave said was one of the most common species, we found 3, all from exactly the same place. And the last 2 there, which I'll talk about more in a minute, we found a lot of. So we quickly realized that we needed a better historical baseline to compare our results to than there used to be a lot of salamanders and there aren't so many. So what we did is we actually did a data mining project with all of the field notes from everybody who had worked on this project from 1970 to 79. Specifically, Dave Wake, we used Jim Lynch's notes very heavily, as well as Ted. And we compiled a database of all of the collecting events And this included not just the salamanders that were actually collected, but those which were seen, because some of them used to be so abundant that they just stopped collecting them after they got 160, 170 salamanders. And we very conservatively estimated the amount of time that was spent searching as well as the number of people. And the reason for this, if they said there were many people searching, we would put, say, 10, which was far more than the people who were actually doing it. If they said we spent a few hours, we'd put 4, which was probably much more time. And the reason that we did this was so that we didn't bias our results in favor of seeing a decline in the past just due to inaccurate methodology. And so the first site I'm going to talk about is Buena Vista at 2,400 meters. This is known to us as the home of the Niño people, because in this part of Guatemala, the salamanders are known as Niños Dormidos, the sleeping children, for reasons that are still somewhat unclear to me. And along with having Ted, who did both the original transect and the modern part with us, we were lucky enough to have this man right here, who's the same guy as is circled right there in a photograph of the Niño people taken in the 1970s, and you may recognize these two gentlemen as well. This was one of the sites where tons of salamanders were collected in the past. Many of them were collected in stumps, such as this one, which is a preferred habitat of Pseudorhizia. It's another stump in the cloud forest, and this is one of the salamanders that we did find there, Dendrotriton vermiliaceus. And from the database, we quantified the number of salamanders collected per person, or seen or collected per person per hour in the 70s and now. And these are the results from that site. And so, as I said before, big changes. 2 of the Pseudorhizia, Granada and Gobelai, used to be extremely abundant, some of the most common salamanders in Guatemala. We saw not a single one in 3 years. The third species, which is entirely endemic to the transect and was actually never described, also appears to be gone. Dendrotriton vermiliaceus, we found once, although we didn't really look for it on the other visits, so I think it's still doing all right. One of the more startling results is that these 2 species here, Blutaglossa morio and Blutaglossa lincolni, appear to still be doing not only just as well as before, but morio is far more common. We found, it used to be one of the rarest species on the transect, and we found them just everywhere we went. And those letters above them, although it looks kind of like a DNA sequence, indicate the ecological, sort of the microhabitat preference of the salamanders. So T is for terrestrial, A is for arboreal, and G is generalist. And you can see that the terrestrial salamanders have really taken a hit. And the generalist ones appear to be the ones that are still doing quite well. And unfortunately, these results are confirmed by what we saw at El Rincon at the upper elevation of this community. As Dave said, Blutaglossa rostrata, which is shown here, used to be just absolutely the most abundant salamander on the transect. They would commonly go up for Linhoek's reproductive studies and get samples of 100 salamanders in a morning or an afternoon. We saw not a single one in 3 years. Again, Pseudorhizia Granada, Gobelai, and the new species undescribed were never seen. Pseudorhizia rex, which also used to be moderately common at the upper elevations, was never seen in 4 years. And again, Blutaglossa morio, much more common than before. And you can see the same trend whether you look at it in salamanders per person per hour or just the percentage of visits on which we found the species. And once again, the terrestrial species doing the worst. And so this is the San Marcos transect as it was in the past. And I'd just like to show you, watch the upper cloud forest community carefully to see what it's changed to in the present. So it's just been absolutely hammered. The Pseudorhizas are gone. Rostrata is gone from almost all of its range. We've only found it at a site which was essentially higher than it was ever found in the past in this area. And Pseudorhizia rex, the 4th terrestrial species in this area, has also completely disappeared from the lower part of its range. Blutaglossa morio appears to be much more abundant, and lincolni appears to have moved up to higher elevations than we've ever found it at before. And if this part of the transect looks okay, that's basically just because we don't have enough data to say how the salamanders are doing there. What we can say is that the wider ranging one in the tropical forest, Blutaglossa occidentalis, does seem to be doing very well, but we don't really have good data on the rest of them. And so, as I said, the upper cloud forest community has changed really dramatically, both in terms of abundance and just presence of species. All of the Pseudorisias appear to be in severe decline, or in the case of Brunata and the undescribed species, possibly extirpated or even extinct, because this was a large part of their very small ranges. The microhabitat generalists, the ones that can live in bromeliads, under rocks, under logs, basically wherever it's moist enough for them, are doing as well as before, or even better than in the 1970s. Whereas the habitat the habitat specialists, the ones with very narrow elevational ranges, the two Pseudorisias, and the terrestrial species, those that only lived on the ground, under rocks and logs, are doing very badly or are possibly extirpated. And we don't know enough to say what's going on in the lower cloud forest, but it could potentially be just as bad. And so this was only one small area of Guatemala. We wanted to check out what was going on in other areas of these species ranges. So we visited Volcan Chicabal, which is one of the volcanoes Dave was talking about, a little bit to the south of the San Marcos Transect. And this is a crater lake in a volcano with beautiful primary cloud forest. It's a sacred site in Mayan cosmology, so it's been protected by the local people who have built altars there and go there to leave offerings and worship. And because of that, the forest is essentially pristine. It's never been logged, and no one seems to use it for anything. The trees are beautiful. There are lots of logs, which are the preferred habitat of many of these species. And it had 3 sympatric species of Pseudorisia, Rex, Gobelii, and Brunata, the same ones as in the upper cloud forest in San Marcos. There were 3 visits in the 1970s by Jim Lynch, Ted, Dave, and others, and they only went there for 3 days. We have sort of a comparable search effort, 2 days of very intensive searching. They found a good number of all 3 of the species in the past. In 2006, Antonio Munoz, our collaborator from Ecosur in Chiapas, found what I fear may be the last Pseudorisia gobelii ever seen. It was the only salamander we found in 2 visits to this site. And while at San Marcos the quality of the habitat has declined in many areas, this cannot possibly be due to habitat destruction, because the habitat is intact. It just has no salamanders in it. And that's a picture of the last gobelii that we ever saw. And although I'm not going to present any data for it, it appears to be a similar situation at the other extreme of these species ranges on Cerro Mozatol in Chiapas. We only made 1 short visit there, whereas the Pseudorisias were very findable in the past. We didn't see any, despite there being very nice habitat. And just to sort of broaden the picture a little bit, all these data points are localities from Pseudorisia rex in our database in the past. The ones with X's over them are where we've searched pretty well and haven't seen any in a couple years. And even where it still exists, you can see the numbers, like we found 1 here, having visited it every year. Gabriella found 1 up here the first year we went, but it used to be hyper-abundant everywhere. Nowhere is it doing well now, and in many areas it just appears to be gone. This is the entire range of Gobelii and Brunata. We haven't found them anywhere. These are the 3 sites that I talked about. And the 4th species, the new one, was only here, and we've never seen it. So the Pseudorisias have really been hit hard. And also, I just wanted to point out at this site, where in the past Rex and Rostrata were the only species ever found, we found the generalist. It seems to be much more abundant at San Marcos, higher than it had ever been observed before. And when we're talking about amphibian declines in Central America, I think an obvious culprit that many people immediately think of is the chytrid fungus, which has been implicated in declines of lots of species, particularly in Central American frogs. And we've been taking skin swabs to try to detect this fungus. Since 2006, we found it throughout Guatemala and Mexico or at least in Guatemala, in 5 frogs of 4 families, and in 12 different salamanders in the genera Volotoglossa and Dendrotriton. This is a paper that our collaborator Carlos Vasquez and Van Zwiedenberg are going to be publishing soon. It's a Volotoglossa conidii. And here you can see a skin section of it showing the infection in the skin. Those are the thalli containing the zoospores of the fungus. And so we have found it. It does clearly infect salamanders. We don't know if it kills them. But we have never found it in any of the species that appear to have undergone a severe decline, partly because we don't find many of them anymore, and we have a very small sample. But all of the ones where we have found it, nearly all, 10 of 12, are the very low elevation banana salamanders. And so it's in a different area essentially than where the big declines have occurred. And so habitat destruction is obviously a factor in some of these declines because the habitat in San Marcos in many areas is not nearly as good as it used to be. A lot of it has been converted to cypress plantation. But it can't possibly be the only explanation because there are still nice areas of what appears to be primary cloud forest. They just don't have salamanders in them. And it has to be something else, at least on Chiapas. The chytrid fungus is potentially involved. We don't really know. We need more data. But we don't know if it kills them, and we don't know if it can infect the species that have declined. And also there's been a lot of buzz about climate change in Central American amphibian declines lately. We're getting climate data now, but so far, this is the weather data from San Marcos, which is basically at the same elevation as the upper cloud forest. We don't see any real evidence of anything obvious anyway, like a number of dry years in a row that could have contributed to these declines. And so with that, Ted is going to talk a little bit about just the arrow, about further research in Guatemala and Mexico with a little bit of a historical perspective.
Okay, again, we're looking at this same slide that we've seen several times, and the background is in 2005, we organized an MVZ trip to Guatemala. One of the main reasons was Gabriela needed new material, fresh tissue of some of these salamanders, particular members of the genus Pseudorhizia. And I assured Gabriela that Pseudorhizia on the San Marcos Transect are the most abundant salamanders in the world. We can quickly go there and we'll spend a day or so, we'll get all the salamanders we need. And you can go on with your study. Well, we went there, and as Sean has pointed out, that certainly was not the case. Okay, and so what I have done is gone through and looked at the notes that we have from the various trips, and I've not only looked at my notes, but I've looked at other people's notes. And what I'd like to point out here is that during my first visit with Dave as a graduate student to El Rincon, the site where the Bolitoglossa rostrata are gone, we collected 109 Bolitoglossa rostrata in between 10:15 a.m. and 12:45 p.m. 12 salamanders under one log. The other interesting thing is we were getting numerous Pseudorhizia, and two of the garter snakes, which we found in the meadow, had Pseudorhizia as stomach contents. Garter snakes were commonly found on all visits to El Rincon in the 1970s. The garter snakes are gone, so that's one step up from this. There are no more salamanders to eat, and the garter snakes are extinct. And before leaving Guatemala, I'm going to now take the story up into Mexico. On this same trip, under one single log, there were 15 salamanders of 4 species. So this is truly the 1970s are in a period of great abundance. Going into Mexico, I'm just going to show one salamander picture. This Pseudorhizia, which was recently described by Gabriela, Dave, and I, is not from one of the transects I'm going to talk about today, but it's a very spectacular salamander from the Veracruz transect. It's only known from 5 specimens, and it has not been seen in 25 years. The Cerro Mozatol transect in Chiapas, I'm just going to very briefly mention. It's a transect that was reasonably well studied, and just point out, as Sean mentioned, that based on our single visit a year and a half ago, it appears that the Pseudorhizia are gone. These are the same species that were occurring in Mexico. One of the transects that was worked extensively early on in Mexico is a transect in Hidalgo, Mexico, El Chico National Park, where 2 species of salamanders in the genus Chiroptertriton were very abundant, multidentatus and Chiroptertriton diminutus. This was my very first trip to Mexico. I went with Dave Wake's student, Sam Sweet. We visited El Chico, not really knowing anything about tropical salamanders, but we very quickly, in a period of a few hours, collected over 100 Chiroptera triton of the two species on December 16, 1972. In 1981, Dave Wake visited the same site and noted that collecting was poor, but we finally did scratch out 5 Chiroptera triton diminutus. They looked around other places, and the absence of Chiroptera titan multidentatus is inexplicable. Why didn't we find it? So as early as 1981, there was some evidence that the great abundances of the 70s, something was not right. Just a line here and there in people's notes, sort of no interpretation. Maybe it was just bad luck, a bad day. But Dave went there in 1997 with Gabriella, who was his student at the time, and he wanted, of course, to show Gabriella the interesting species of Chiroptera triton. They were at the same site that I had been with Sam Sweet, where we got 100 in a couple of hours, and conditions were good, and Gabriella found a Chiroptera triton diminuta in 1997. So we've gone to several people looking in 1997, finding 1 salamander, to Sam and I looking for a couple of hours and finding over 100. This is what's happened at El Chico National Park, and this is based, again, it's not, the data aren't as detailed as the ones that Sean has analyzed, but it's enough to pull out from our field notes and the collections that we made that there's been, going from abundance to near extinction since 1971. And this is a slide that Gabriella has prepared. Maybe if we finish a little early, there'll be a little time for more comment. But what this particular area, Sierra Chicoaxtla in Veracruz, was the site of 6 species of salamanders. The top 3, other than Pseudoerythra nigromaculata, 1 was seen last year, single specimen. They have not been seen since '97. The only salamanders still present in small numbers are 3 low elevation Tubulidoglossa and Alinea triton. But again, as you can see, the Thorius pinacculus was generally findable in all visits since the first visit in 1936, not by the museum, but Hobart Smith and Edward Taylor, through '76. The Thorius were predictably found, and now they are no more. And this is a species that is endemic to this one site, was endemic to this one site. The area that we have a pretty good database on, perhaps the best studied transect in Mexico, is the Oaxaca Transect, which consists of 2 mountains, Cerro San Felipe and Cerro Pelon. This is an old picture, but it's pointing out that there were a number of new species discovered. I think 8 new species were discovered during a number of years of research on the transect. But we have the best data for Pseudoerythia smithi and Pseudoerythia unguidensis, and I'm going to finish up my portion of this presentation by discussing the situation of these 2 species, Pseudoerythia smithi and Pseudoerythia unguidensis. And this was one of my first trips into the area, and this is Cerro San Felipe. This is the ruins of Monte Alban. This is Oaxaca, the capital of the state, and Cerro San Felipe looms in excess of 3,000 meters above Oaxaca. It's a very accessible site. And then and now, the forest was in very good condition. Yes. This is the forest in Cerro San Felipe as it looked then and now. It's a protected area. It's a watershed. It's a national forest. It's a watershed for the city of Oaxaca. And there is a fair amount of cover. There's plenty of stuff, as there was in the past, logs, good forest, very sufficient habitat. And on my first visit to that site in 1974, I was amazed. Salamanders were found immediately. Under the first log turned, I found 8 suduricians. And this is a large salamander. It's the size of our arboreal salamander, Aeneades farius. It's a massive salamander. They were the most abundant salamander I ever seen. In 2 hours, we collected 163 Suduricea smithi. They occupy several gallon jars in the collection right now. We went to another site, and there I found 20 adults under a 12-inch by 12-inch piece of bark. At the second site, on the same day, we collected 65 Suduricea smithi and saw about 150 more. At this point, we had 163 plus 65. Our containers were full. We were facing like many, many hours of preserving that night, so we just sort of left behind the remaining 150 Suduricea smithi. We went back in 1984, Jim Lynch and I, just to check out the site. This is 10 years later. We drove up Cerro San Felipe, worked for 2 hours, saw only 4 Suduricea and a single P. smithi. Conditions seemed favorable, but no salamanders in abundance. Where did they go? P. smithi is usually abundant. So in 1984, again, a couple of lines in notes noting this mysterious thing. There don't seem to be any salamanders, but no big deal about it. It's just a couple of lines in a day's journal. Then Dave goes up there with Gabriella to show her Suduricea smithi in 1997. Dave got a subadult Suduricea smithi, a subadult, in 1997. Gabriella and I, Mario and others, visited the site a little bit later, and we hunted around, and Gabriella's notes in August of '99 found several Scaloperas, but no Sallies. In other words, the salamanders appear to be Cerro San Felipe. Again, this place, where they were so incredibly abundant in the 70s, they've disappeared. And what we can look at, the situation here, which is very well documented with a number of visits, this other species, Suduricea unguidentis, was never super common, but it was around. It was not seen after 1976. They were sympatric. Suduricea unguidentis was more of an underbark specialist. Suduricea smithi was underbark, but also under and inside logs on the ground. And you can see declining from collections of hundreds to a dramatic decrease and a disappearance by 99. And here is a summary slide that Sean has prepared, basically showing the San Felipe, the El Chico, and the Cerro Chico-Oaxaca, which I've talked about individually, but you can see that in these 3 sites, far removed from each other, no species overlapping, there have been these dramatic declines. And in a minute, I'm going to turn this over to Dave to sort of do some concluding remarks, but I just have a short summary, which, in interest of time, rather than putting it as a PowerPoint, I'm just going to go over it. Our recent surveys are in some ways like the California Grinnell projects, in that we are resurveying elevational transects that were studied in great detail by Dave Wake and students in the 1970s. Now, over a third of a century later, we can compare present salamander distributions and abundances with past. It is clear that in all the sites, there have been dramatic declines in some species. The causes are not understood, but the declines are real. If Dave Wake, as a new MVZ faculty member in the year 2008, decided to start these studies now, he would quickly abandon the project on tropical salamanders because so many of the species are either now absent or extremely rare. The Oaxaca Transect produced 8 new species in the 1970s. All are now either very rare or perhaps extinct. If Dave went to Cerro San Felipe today, he would note in his journal that the habitat looks good for salamanders, but they are strangely absent, as are the snakes that in the past were so often encountered with salamanders in their stomachs. The declines are disturbing, and the sites we are looking at now are few compared to all the other possible transects in Mexico and Guatemala. If surveys were just starting today, I wonder how many new species would never have been discovered, and since even in the 1970s, a decade of salamander abundance, only a few transects were studied in detail. I am certain that some species of tropical salamanders have gone extinct before we ever discovered and described them. And now Dave will sort of bring this to a conclusion.
All of this has been going on during a period where we have been trying to we've been trying to develop a robust phylogenetic hypothesis for the tropical salamanders. And this is a very much collapsed slide which shows the current hypothesis, and it just shows three different levels. First, this group down here is fundamentally a group of southern Central American forms, by and large. Some of them, like Cryptotriton, get up into Mexico, but this is basically a southern group. And the species in decline, well, we haven't seen Bradytriton since it was described, essentially, in 1977, I think. Nyctinolis has been collected recently, so we know at least it still persists. But the other species, the other genera that occur in Guatemala, we don't have any reason to think that they're in decline. We just don't have much information about this group, but we don't have any evidence of declines. If we look at the next group, which is Glotoglossa here, Glotoglossa has 6 clades and that occur in Guatemala and Chiapas, and here they are listed. And only Glotoglossa rostrata, which is in the clade Magnadigita, has clearly disappeared, or essentially disappeared. So that one is in decline. But it's this remaining group where the big problem seems to be focused. This is the genus Pseudorisia, Chiropterotriton, and Thorius, these 3 genera. And Thorius is particularly hard hit. We haven't said much about it today, but this is a group that Gabriella and Jim Hankin and I have been studying in particular. Thorius, Chiropterotriton, very heavily hit, and the Pseudorisias are very heavily hit. Usually more than half the species are not findable, and those that are findable are present in very, very low numbers. So this really concludes our presentation today, and we'd like to leave a little time for questions. I think that the problem, we've displayed the problem, that is, where once we had a thriving research program based on abundant organisms in which we could do all kinds of studies, we now have to look very hard to find any salamanders, with very few exceptions. And we are missing some of the most common species from the past. They've simply disappeared. We have a suspicion that the chytrid might be involved, but we have very little else to go on. And so we're continuing to study this. Ted and Sean have just recently returned from Honduras. Gabriella and her students are continuing to study this system, but at the present time we have to leave this as a mysterious disappearance. You hear a lot about frogs and frog disappearances. Proportionally, I think salamanders are in worse shape in Central America than the frogs are. Although, I have to say at the same time, we always used to find frogs when we were looking for salamanders, as we would find snakes. But now the days pass in peace because you're doing a lot of work, but you're not seeing anything. And it's a very dramatic change. All right, I'd be happy to take questions. Turn on the left.
The patience for the technology, we'll work on that. Gabriella, do you know anything before we go to questions?
Well, just basically that we're finding the same pattern in Mexico in higher, mainly with higher elevation. We're finding the same pattern in Mexico with mostly high elevation species. So as Dave mentioned, Pseudorisia and Thorius, which occur above 2,000 meters, they're mostly gone. And I cannot think of a single species that I can say is abundant. When we find a lot of specimens, it means around 20, maybe 15, 20, then we're happy. But then the harder ones, we just never see them. And we're finding chytrids, but in the low elevation ones, well, the high elevations, we're not finding them. So, but we don't find dead salamanders also. We just don't know.
One thing to point out, and I mentioned on it, and we have not studied carefully the snakes, but at least on the San Marcos Transect, garter snakes were found every visit to El Rincon. The salamanders were always 100 times as common as the frogs. Frogs were not common at El Rincon because they're only the Eleutherodactyla type non-pond breeding frogs, not very good habitat for them. Clearly the salamanders, with their incredible abundance, were a major food source for other vertebrates, and our observations on garter snakes, but certainly other organisms have been affected.
Okay, thank you. So let's get some questions before Mark keep going.
Yes, Leo?
I think maybe another way to attack the mystery is not looking at the ones that disappeared, but why are the ones that are still there in numbers persistent? In other words,
yes.
If you can determine what it is that constitutes success in the environment,
well,
you can maybe infer what is missing for the species.
Good point. And we have thought about that. As Sean mentioned, it's the generalists. The ecological, because we had all that microhabitat information, we know which ones are missing. It's the specialists that are missing and the generalists that have survived. That one that was dead center in that triangular, that's the Blue-glossal Lincolni. That's the one that has increased in numbers. Morio has increased even more dramatically.
And I think you also mentioned that some of the bromeliad specialists are still doing okay.
They seem to be.
So it's not just a general specialist thing, it's something about the terrestriality or...
Well, it's the terrestrial ones that are really, the terrestrial ones are the ones that are most heavily hit.
Alan, then.
So a couple of tracks in those notes, Scolophorus were mentioned.
Yes.
Has there been any pattern of change in Scolophorus?
We still see them.
We see them pretty common.
Fairly commonly.
So they don't seem to be.
No. There has been a report from La Selva, Costa Rica, that shows that not only have amphibians declined in general, but also lizards have declined. But we haven't seen. We're above the ranges of almost everything except Scolophorus.
So Jimmy Benza.
So is the cloud layer intact there? Do you think that this could have something to do with like the same problem they had
in Costa Rica, the cloud forest has risen. This is a very different situation. In Costa Rica, the highest elevation is 1,800 meters. But this one, we've got a mountain that goes up to 4,200 meters right there. So the situation is quite different. I haven't seen any difference. Marbley and I joined Ted and Sean and Gabriella on a trip to Guatemala 2 years ago, I guess, a year and a half ago, and we got lost in fog.
Very much the same question. In other words, to what extent is this phenomenon limited to the cloud forest, or is it much more general than that? So if it's limited to the cloud forest, that tells us something important like that.
The Cerro San Felipe is well above cloud forest, and the city of Rizzi are going.
And the same situation in the Sierra de los Cuchimatanes, which is another very high upland area in Guatemala, where Pseudoerythia rex used to just be everywhere, and there's still plenty of logs. It's actually above the level of forest and bunch grass habitat, and you just don't see them anymore.
Yes, the Sierra, that's a very good point, because the Sierra de los Cuchimatanes, you drive for many, many kilometers at elevations over 3,000, right around 3,000 meters, and it's above, it's in bunch grass, so it's not habitat specialists.
So Dave, one thing you mentioned is that the context first, when the amphibian and urine declines were first being reported, people were commenting on some of the urine being sort of explosive breeders, huge reproductive rates, and a whole lot of species have been recently described and they disappeared. So maybe it was some massive numerical fluctuation. You have a case here where the area was worked before, many of the species that you saw in abundance weren't seen previously. Now you can't see them again. So is there any possibility at all, you think, that this could be at least partly natural fluctuation?
Well, it's hard to understand why Schmidt didn't find some of the species we didn't find, but I could give you some explanations for it. I don't think the species that he found in abundance, we also found in abundance.
Okay.
So part of it was, there's one cryptic species was involved. That would explain some of it. Another factor is that Politicus rostrata may have been absent from that site because rostrata is fundamentally a plateau species, and he was on the face of the volcano itself rather than where the volcano attaches to the plateau, which is where we were working. So there are explanations. I don't see any evidence of big long-term fluctuations like that. That always has to be considered.
Well, these also have pretty low reproductive rates compared to neurons. So.
Yes, they do. They're not explosive breeders, and they lay eggs on land in small clutches. They have high survivorship once they hatch, and the adults will live. We expect that they live probably 8 years or even longer.
Or used to.
Yes.
So what do these guys eat? I'm wondering if their own food sources.
They're very generalized in their feeding habits. They eat anything their tongue can catch and hold. Basically, arthropods, small arthropods, but including snails also.
Do you happen to notice if they're still abundant, the arthropods and I mean, for generalists, yes, but I was wondering, I don't know if the specialists.
Yeah, well, I don't see any big change in mesofauna. We haven't quantified that.
Okay.
Is there any possibility that there's a big, large-scale data population dynamics in places where you cannot
Well,
it's the old trauma of where you find something that's always going to be declining and places where you have a lot of it's increasing.
I think we've sampled broadly enough to not be concerned about that, but also these organisms, a lot of high elevation frogs do occur in metapopulations, and it's been documented. This is particularly true where you have migrations to breeding sites, but we don't have anything like that. Based on home range studies that have been done in California on related species, their home ranges are on the orders of tens of meters. It's really, or even less. So they don't move during their lifespans. They're very philopatric. They just stay very close to where they were born. That's not really conducive to setting up metapopulation systems. So I think of them as, I think these salamanders originally as being just spread everywhere, and you'd find them where you could turn something, or where you could locate them. And to think in terms of cubic space rather than just terrestrial space, because they're in the trees, they're in the ground, they're on the ground, they're under bark, they were everywhere really.
I think I'll have to draw the formal session to a close so people can get to class, and of course others can stay on and ask questions. Join me in thanking you guys for stimulating the